Welcome to ChessStrategiesBlog.com. This is the 7th in my series of articles about chess rules for the absolute chess beginner, and we're going to cover the rules for castling in this article, this video, and in the next two we'll cover en passant pawn capture and pawn promotion. I had originally thought to have those all three in one video, but there's just too much, so we're going to split those up into three different ones. And then after that, we'll move on to check and checkmate, including a series of articles on how to checkmate, which I think should be very interesting, and I'm looking forward to doing that. So let's get started with the rules for castling. And I'm going to start just by listing the rules, and then we'll illustrate them with a video in just a moment. Once, and only once, during a game, a player may move his king 2 squares to the right or left and move the rook on that side, that is the rook toward which the king moved, over the king to the square adjacent to the king. There are 5 conditions that must be met in order to castle. First, the squares between the king and the rook used for castling must be empty. You can't castle over your own or enemy pieces. Second, the king may not castle into or through check. If the king would be in check at the end of the castling move, or if the square that the king passes over is guarded by an enemy piece, then castling is not allowed. Third, the king may not castle out of check. Fourth, the king may not have made a previous move. If the king has moved, even if it subsequently moved back to its home square, castling is not permitted. And fifth, if one of the rooks has moved, castling is prohibited with that rook. Castling would still be permitted with the other rook, provided it has not moved and the other conditions are met. Those are the rules for castling. Now let's take a look at some examples. Let's go back to the beginning of this position, to the starting position, and step through the moves to this short game. White moves his pawn to e4. Black moves his pawn to e5. White moves a knight to f3, and black moves a knight to c6, and then white moves bishop to c4 and bishop to c5. And now the white player may castle if he wishes. The castling move works like this. The king moves toward the corner 2 squares along the first rank. This is the first rank here. The king moves 2 squares toward the corner, and the rook that it moves toward jumps over the king and lands on the square next to it. We might see the same thing on the black side of the board. Let's say that black moves his knight to f6, and white moves a pawn to c3. Black now has the space empty between the king and the rook, and he can move his king over 2 squares, and then the rook moves over beside it, and that's castling. Look at the article that accompanies this video to see the reasons why you want to castle. It's always a good idea to castle early in the game if you can. Let's take a look at a couple more examples. In this case, here's a position where white has moved all of the pieces between his king and his queenside rook, and rather than waiting to castle to the king side, white might decide that he wants to castle to the queen side in order to move his rook toward the center of the board and get his king into a more safe position. In that case, you still move the king 2 squares toward the corner, and the rook will jump over the king and land on the square adjacent to it, opposite the king. That's called castling queenside or castling long. Now let's illustrate the conditions that are necessary to castle legally. Here, if white castles, black may not castle because there's a knight between the king and the rook, and a queen and a bishop between the king and the queenside rook. The space must be empty between the king and rook in order to castle. Now we'll illustrate the various rules about check. First of all, let's imagine that in this position it's black's move, and black moves bishop takes knight on c3, check. White here cannot castle out of check. The rules specify that if the king is in check, he may not castle. Besides that, this castling here would be a bad move because black has just captured a piece, and if white does not recapture it, he'll be down a piece, which is usually enough to lose the game. But in any case, the rules specify that a player may not castle out of check. In this case, white may not castle his king because his king is in check. He will have to either block the check or, more sensibly, capture the checking piece either by knight takes bishop on c3 or pawn takes bishop on c3. And here's another case where check is a factor. Let's take a look at this position. It's black's move, and black moves pawn to d6. And now if white would want to castle, the rules would not permit him to castle, because in order to castle, the king would have to move to g1 here. Can't castle queenside. He can't castle to the queen side, obviously, because the queen and bishop are in the way. And so if he wanted to castle to the king side, his king would have to go to g1. And that square is attacked by the bishop at c5. And that means the king would be in check, and castling would not be permitted in this instance. The king may not castle into check. By the way, I'll have another video on the concepts of check and checkmate coming shortly. And here's another position where the white player has moved all of the pieces between his king and his queenside rook. And he may want to castle in order to protect his king. But in order to castle, he would have to move across this square, d1, which is being guarded by the black bishop at g4. We call that castling across check, and the rules do not permit the king to castle where he has to cross over a square that is being attacked by an enemy piece. So in this case, the white king would not be permitted to castle on the queen side. Now let's take this position. It's black's turn, and he moves queen to f8. Now let's say that white plays queen takes f8. Black has two responses. Black can either play rook takes f8, in which case now black would not be permitted to castle to the king side, even if the rook were to move back to its original square at h8. The rook, having moved, may not now participate in the castling move. Later, the king might still castle to the queen side because this queen rook has not moved, but it has given up the right to castle to the king side. After queen takes queen, black might play king takes queen on f8. And in that case, black has forfeited the right to castle on either side. Once the king has moved, it is no longer allowed to castle. Well, that's all I have for today on the rules about castling. Be sure to check back for more great videos at www.chessstrategiesblog.com, and I'll hope to talk to you again soon. Thanks very much.